Welcome to the Qasim Rashid Show, a civil rights lawyer here to expose all forms of injustice with a sprinkling of dad jokes in between. Here's your host, Qasim Rashid.
Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful Sunday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. My friends, thank you all for tuning in. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you hit that subscribe button so we can continue to bring you amazing content on human rights and media accountability. Grateful y'all listen to the show. Grateful for the feedback. Let's keep it coming. We've got a great show lined up today. Tim Whitaker is here, and he's somebody I had not heard of up until a few months ago, and he's fascinating. He's a creator and facilitator of a group called the New Evangelicals. It's a left-wing Christian evangelical group. You heard that right, a left-wing Christian evangelical group. So I promise we're not going to be scripture thumping here, but what he brings is a really powerful perspective that I'm fascinated by, and I wanted to bring him on to discuss not just his journey from being right-wing to being left-wing, because it's a cool journey, but we hung out at the DNC last week. I want to better understand what the rise of left-wing Christianity means and the importance of stepping outside your comfort zones when engaging in interfaith dialogue and also on self-reflection, because these are some of the best things that we can do. So what are the best practices to do that as well? Anyway, fascinating guy. He'll be on at in the middle of the show. But speaking of right-wing extremism, which he got away from, I want to start the show by talking about the gender apartheid being imposed by the Taliban against women in Afghanistan, because this is one of the most horrifying stories of the year, and it's getting very little media attention. Now, as you all know, the United States invaded Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks back in 2001. And then militarily occupied Afghanistan for the next, 2 decades, 21 years, 22 years. And little known fact, we were spending $250 million a day doing that. All right, $250 million per day. So anytime the government says we can't afford healthcare, or we can't afford childcare, or we can't afford paid time off, it's a bunch of crap. We spent $250 million in taxpayer money per day that we're still paying off, and in fact, it's getting worse because the interest is outpacing what we're paying back per day. And we did it to invade Afghanistan and allegedly get rid of the Taliban. Well, as we all know, within 11 seconds of us withdrawing from Afghanistan, finally, the Taliban took control once more and has been in control since 2022. And we'll talk about what caused that and how that happened. But right now, the urgent issue at hand is that the Taliban Minister of Education has announced that the girls' schools that they temporarily closed back in 2022 is now going to be a permanent ban. They're shutting down women's schools, girls' schools permanently, period. Worse, they now have a ban on women from speaking in public. I'm reading from The Guardian here. The new Taliban laws that prohibit women from speaking or showing their faces outside their homes have been condemned by the UN and met with horror by human rights groups. The Taliban published what's known as a vice and virtue law, approved by the Supreme Leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, which state that women must completely veil their bodies, including their faces, in thick clothing at all times in public to avoid leading men into temptation and vice. I'm sorry, but if you're a man and can't control yourself, you should be the one staying inside the house, not forcing women to do so. Women's voices are also deemed to be, quote, potential instruments of vice, end quote. And so therefore, the Taliban is banning women to be heard in public. They must not be heard singing or reading aloud, even from inside their houses, which is just insane to me for any number of reasons that I can get into later on. But let me reiterate this point. If you're a guy and seeing a woman gets you so aroused that you can't control yourself, you're the problem. You, exclusively you. There's nobody else. It's exclusively you. And you should get some real psychological help, because it sounds like you have a real mental issue. If you're that pathetic and weak and insecure, you are the one who's the problem, not women. And so it's insane to me, this apartheid level condition that women are suffering through. And I want to talk about two main things. One, debunking it from the Islamic perspective, and two, addressing how we got here and how we get the hell out of here. From the Islamic perspective, to me, this is just vile, what's happening to women in Afghanistan. It's apartheid. It's inexcusable. It's completely contrary to the Islamic tenets of seeking education. And adding to these injustices that these women are facing, these Afghan women are facing, are now centuries of imperialism and Western interventionism, because that's also contributed to this immensely. 1400 years ago, when Islam was founded, Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, declared clearly that it is incumbent upon every Muslim male and every Muslim female to attain education. He didn't say it's a good idea. He didn't say you should try. He said it is incumbent. And he specifically said Muslim male and Muslim female. So that right there undermines everything the Taliban is doing. These people are ignorant terrorists. They have no idea what the hell they're talking about. And in his farewell address, literally his last public speech that he delivered, he said, quote, "Do treat women well and be kind to them, for they are your partners," end quote. Partners, right? Equal partners, not servants, not subservient, not they serve you or they are liable to listen to everything you say as a dictator. No, they're your equal partners. And more than words, he exemplified these teachings with his actions. His first wife, Khadija, was a wealthy CEO. She was his employer. And while the Taliban is forbidding women from attaining education or playing any public role in society, Khadija was a well-known and well-regarded entrepreneur. She ran a thriving trading business. And far from condemning her behavior, Prophet Muhammad praised his wife Khadija as the example for women to follow. A woman who is proud, confident, educated, wealthy, innovative, compassionate, and, by the way, also chose to be a wife and mother. After she died, after 25 years of marriage, she died due to a vicious boycott against the Muslims. He remarried, and his wife Aisha was a premier jurist and scholar. She played a critical role, just an absolutely critical role, in educating the early Muslims about religion, about the religion of Islam, about the Prophet's life, about his habits. And she narrated more than 2,200 sayings of the Prophet, because she lived about another 44 years after he died. And what she narrated has it has become, in many ways, the foundation of Islamic jurisprudence. And on topics like marriage and divorce and inheritance and economic justice, social justice, climate justice, the Hajj pilgrimage, the list goes on and on. It's no wonder that the Prophet said about her, he praised her knowledge, saying, "Learn half of your faith from Aisha." It's a statement he made about no male Muslim whatsoever. And so every restriction and form of oppression the Taliban is imposing upon women is not due to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. It's due to ignoring and opposing his teachings. And I can give a whole 10 episode thesis on this, but that should suffice enough that this is not an Islamic issue. This is a patriarchal issue. This is a misogynistic issue. And adding to this oppression of Afghan women is the immeasurably harmful impact of imperialism and Western interventionism. And much has been written about this, about the devastating role that Russia played in attempting to invade Afghanistan, the response from the United States in arming the Mujahideen. Washington Post managing editor Steve Cole details this extensively in his book. It's called Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden from the Soviet invasion to September 10th, 2001. And remember, even a decade before 9/11, there were papers publishing just effusive praise, just overwhelming praise of who? Of Osama bin Laden. I'm reading one from The Independent from 1991, from December 1995, which says, has got a picture of bin Laden smiling, like a big old smile, big old grin on his face. And the headline says, "Anti-Soviet warrior puts his army on the road to peace." This is Osama bin Laden. I mean, being praised by Western media, less than a decade before 9/11. And so prior to Russian and US interventionism in wars, the United Kingdom played its part in overthrowing previous Afghan governments in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In fact, in the early 20th century, the Afghan king and queen wanted to establish a more Western secular government where people could worship as they wished, but didn't have to wear what's considered like a hijab or be forced to worship, which is a brilliant concept. And so they actually went to Europe and met with European dignitaries and kings And what did the British government do? They took photographs of the Afghan queen shaking hands with men, not wearing a hijab, and sent those photographs back to Afghanistan, had them mass printed, and had right-wing evangelicals propagandize that, look, she's going to undermine our faith, our culture, we need to overthrow them. They radicalized people, the British government did, and helped overthrow the Afghan king and queen because they didn't want them to have the opportunity to develop a society that was based on secular justice as opposed to keeping them fighting amongst one another. The oldest trick in the book. And this has been going on for centuries. But here's the thing. We don't need to go back centuries. We don't even need to go back decades to 9/11 and the decades prior to 9/11. This is a contemporary atrocity. Before leaving office, Donald Trump made impossible the hope of a safe and secure Afghanistan. How? By forcing the release of at least 5,000 Taliban terrorists. General H.R. McMaster, who obviously was general under Trump, told CNN last week that Trump, while president, sought to negotiate with the Taliban as U.S. troops began leaving Afghanistan. And this was completely while undermining the Afghan government. And as a result, the U.S. government forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 members of the Taliban. This was not done for any concession or military advantage. No, it was just a unilateral demand by the Trump administration and forced upon the Afghan government. Is it any wonder, therefore, that the Afghan government fell so quickly upon the United States withdrawal? Is it any wonder? And by the way, this is what Trump is doing with the January 6th insurrectionists as well. He's now throwing a friggin' award ceremony for the January 6th insurrectionists at Mar-a-Lago. But this is what this guy does. He's an anarchist. He's absolutely supporting terrorism, which makes him a terrorist. So, right now, the roughly 43 million people in Afghanistan, roughly 22 million women and girls in Afghanistan are living under this gender apartheid. Because in major part due to these centuries of Western imperialism and interventionism, combined by an abject failure in Muslim leadership, who are not only violating every basic tenet of Islamic jurisprudence, I don't think they've actually ever read any basic tenet of Islamic jurisprudence. 22 million women and girls in Afghanistan are living under gender apartheid. And what's interesting is that the past actually attests to examples when Afghan leaders have themselves afforded basic rights to women in Afghanistan. I already shared about the king and queen of Afghanistan in the early 20th century, but even in the mid 20th century, there was a secular but pro-Soviet general named Muhammad Daud Khan in 1957, 4 years after he became prime minister. He proposed a new law and enacted it that ensured women could attend university and could ensure that women could, after graduating from university, enter the workforce. Right? I mean, this is 1957. And by the way, this was before the United States gave women economic justice in 1974. Women couldn't get basic economic rights before 1974. Afghanistan had offered that to women and protected that to women nearly 20 years before the United States had. So don't come at me with, oh, well, it's just their culture to be oppressive. No, if that's the case, their culture provided women equal justice decades before American culture did. So what does it say about us? And by 1975, Khan even proposed a new Afghan constitution that guaranteed women equal justice under the law and additional basic rights. And what happened? A volatile series of military coups funded by outside forces, followed by the US government in the early 1980s, arming the Mujahideen. Reagan did this. He brought them to the White House. Why? To combat Soviet communism. That's why. They didn't want the Soviets to get a foothold in Afghanistan. And so what they did was they overthrew the entire country. And so it ensured that those rights would never come to fruition for Afghan women, for Afghan people in general. And so thus the cycle today is not new. It's a repetition of the atrocities imposed upon Afghanistan, upon Afghan women in particular for centuries. And the solution has to be making a sense of accountability. It's not going to happen through force or war, but it's going to happen through diplomatic efforts on a global scale. The US can lead it if they stop trying to fund the people trying to violently overthrow the government. It's a much longer conversation, but that's where we are right now. All right, thanks for letting me get that off my chest. My heart, my prayers go out to the women of Afghanistan. They don't deserve this. And it's just infuriating to me that tens of millions of women and children are suffering now horrifically due to these types of atrocities that the U.S. unfortunately is complicit in. All right, when we come back from break, we will bring on Tim Whitaker, creator, founder of the New Evangelicals. Really excited about this conversation. Really brilliant guy. You can follow him on social media at the New Evangelicals. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you hit that subscribe button so we can keep creating this awesome content. I am so excited to welcome Tim Whitaker, creator and facilitator of the New Evangelicals, a left-wing Christian evangelical group. You heard that right, left-wing. His work is fascinating. I got wise to it earlier this year. We got to hang out at the DNC, and I walking through the hallway, I see this tall, dashingly good-looking guy. I'm like, "Is that Tim?" And it actually was. So we hung out, and I've had a chance to go on his show. You should check it out as well. But I wanted to bring him on to kind of talk about his journey. He grew up in evangelical spaces until years later he describes that studying and questions caused him to no longer be welcomed in his church community. Obviously a devastating experience, many have described that, but Tim did something a little bit different. He continued to pursue deeper into his faith to get a better understanding of the faith, the history, the theology, and the evangelical church. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized the importance of advocating for marginalized communities on a global scale, that's how you exemplify Christian teachings. That's the best come to Jesus story I've ever heard. I love it. Tim, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, my friend. It is great to see you again, and thanks for the invite. It's truly an honor.
Yeah, absolutely, man. My listeners know I'm adamant that we bring on guests who don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk, that have done the work. And you're doing that, and I'm watching your advocacy. You're pretty relentless in being unapologetic about speaking up for marginalized communities and tying it to your faith. And I love that, because I think so often people see faith or religion as the excuse or the obstacle to speak up for marginalized communities. And to me, if your faith has a moral code that teaches you that others are less than, well, that's not a faith, that's a cult. And it's exciting to see this new wave of people of faith who are unapologetic about their faith and unapologetic about using that to drive their motivation to serve all humanity. Talk about that journey for you. What was kind of again, not to be too punny, but what was kind of the come to Jesus moment where you said, hold on a second, maybe I'm doing this wrong?
Yeah, well, I did grow up pretty deeply embedded in pretty conservative evangelical spaces. I was homeschooled for most of my life, went to a small private school where I graduated top 5 in my class out of 6. I was really proud of that accomplishment. Excuse me. But yeah, I mean, I've always been, for your audience out there who knows about the evangelical subculture and the organizations and the missions work and the church culture and the worship culture, I was fully embedded in all of that. I did all the right things. I was fully committed to Jesus. Over time, a lot of twists and turns, I got to a point where my desire was always to take my faith more and more seriously. I was never someone who had questions about God or even Jesus. It was more about, what do I believe about God and about Jesus, and how does it impact my life? I love the idea of I love using the phrase having radical allegiance to the way of Jesus. That's kind of always been my mantra.
Love that.
And ultimately, I would say the big grenade was definitely the rise of Trump in evangelical spaces. That was the moment where I said to myself, something is wrong. Like I can't square the integrity and values I was told to have as a white evangelical and the sexual purity I was told to have as a white evangelical. And then all of a sudden, I'm told to vote for the guy who's grabbing women, who's on the cover of Playboy magazine and on his third marriage, and also kind of sounds like a bully. And so that was the beginning of me saying, I think that I have a problem here with like the direction I'm headed in compared to the direction that my particular faith tradition was headed in.
Yeah.
And so between that and of course the Black Lives Matter movement and watching all of that happen and then the COVID response, all three of those things really got me to a point where I said, I think we need like a new evangelical something. And so
Yes.
no one had the name. I grabbed it on social media, had no clue what would happen because I was a no name. I'm not, I was never well known in that world. I was just a church volunteer in South Jersey. And the account kind of blew up because it turns out a lot of people who grew up like me were also renegotiating what it meant to be a Christian for them. And they were finding themselves more and more at odds with the dominant evangelical culture and what they were advocating for politically, culturally, and even theologically.
How do you reconcile the right-wing militant views on things like abortion, where life begins at conception, and depending on who you talk to, IVF is murder?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the path that you've taken? I mean, I'm asking for my audience. It's not a challenge to you because I think it's an important question to air out.
Super
Because
important.
a lot of folks, and I have friends, I went to law school in Virginia, in Richmond, capital of the Confederacy, still a lot of really conservative people there. And it's so funny how you'll have folks who will vote for Trump, but be like, oh, but you're not like the other Muslims that he talks about. You're one of the good ones, right? And so like on the
Yes.
personal level, they always find a way to reconcile it. But on a policy level, how do you have that conversation with the conservative evangelicals to say that it's actually a contradiction to walk in the way of Jesus, but then be so restrictive and discriminatory to people on something like reproductive health? And in fact, the correct way, the biblically correct way, even like let alone the common sense aspect of it, that a fertilized egg is not a human being, but even the biblically correct way is to recognize people's personal circumstances and give them that space to have that journey on their own.
Well, like I'm sure any holy book, including the Bible, can be used as a tool for liberation or a weapon for oppression. Like
Sure.
I've witnessed this in my tradition, right? And when I realized that in particular the abortion conversation came from somewhere outside the Bible, because the Bible says nothing about abortion. I mean, the closest you get is an obscure passage in Exodus 22, where really the fetus has less value than the woman does
Right.
in that text.
That's
But there's
explicitly.
nothing else about abortion in the Bible.
Yeah.
And when you realize that this manufactured outrage comes from the moral majority in the 80s, Jerry Falwell, a way to really politicize evangelicals. And then you also look at the data. You look at how abortion rates have been falling since the 90s. They've fallen the most through Democratic presidents, by the way. And
Yep.
because of Roe v. Wade being overturned, there's some speculation that they actually might go up. And then you also consider that in states where abortion access is greatly restricted, infant and maternal mortality rates go up. This is Texas,
Right.
62%, right? So I started saying, well, what does the data show? Because frankly, I think most people I talk to agree, like, hey, if we can reduce the amount of what I call are unnecessary abortions, meaning they could have been prevented before someone got pregnant, something like that.
Yeah.
I'm all about it. Like, hey, let's do whatever we can. Expand contraceptives, expand affordable wages. Make sure that single moms have the support that they need, access
Excellent.
to childcare, etc. Those all reduce abortion rates. When my tradition said, well, that's socialism, we can't do that. We just have to make sure that it's illegal. I said, I'm not sure this is really about a quote unquote pro-life ethic, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of me changing my mind was born out of just kind of realizing that, and also, of course, personal experience. When my wife got pregnant for the first time, and we had the full big first doctor visit, and they walk through with you everything that could go wrong. And
Right.
then they told us, hey, if the fetus is diagnosed with this genetic disorder, the chances of survivability are like 2% or 1% or 0%. And then they said, if that ever happened, you would have to make a decision. And that was the first time where I said, what do you mean? Oh, you mean that decision? And I said to myself, if we were ever, and thankfully we were not, but if we were ever forced into that nightmare position where my wife and I were forced to make an unfathomable choice, better it's up to us and my medical provider than the government telling me what my wife must or must not do with her body. And so I
I
think those
I
things
think you
all
nailed it.
formed that belief.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think that point about such a complex, nuanced, case by case circumstance, just to relegate that to this bureaucratic government is bizarre. And to have the party who claims that the party of small government claim that that's a better option, it's this compartmentalization and hypocrisy that is just, it's amazing to me that they don't see it.
Well, can I just add maybe one personal story so people know
Please.
exactly how deep in I was in this world because I was brought up in it. I did march at the March for Life rallies. I had a shirt by a group called Rock for Life, and I was 15 years old. I wore this
Mm,
shirt. It was in the biggest lettering you've ever seen. It said on the front, "Abortion is homicide." And
wow.
on the back, it had three statements. It said, "You will not silence my message. You will not mock my God. You will stop killing my generation."
Mm,
I grew up believing that abortion was murder, that essentially people were just killing toddlers was kind of the propaganda or the dogma. So that's a very intense belief when your brain's formed around that. But again, when I realized the complexity and the nuance and how most abortions happen in the first trimester and like 0.2% happen in the third, and when that happens, something's gone terribly wrong.
pretty
It's not
wrong.
because someone just wants to murder someone.
Yeah.
That changed my perspective on what's actually going on.
Yeah, no, very, very well said. If you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Tim Whitaker, creator facilitator of the New Evangelical, the left-wing Christian evangelical group. You can follow him across social media platforms at the New Evangelicals. Brilliant content, thoughtful, compassionate, and certainly engaging, and will make you think. I feel like, Tim, you're the guy that I send to my conservative friends to say, if you don't want to hear it from me, hear it from someone who's walked in your shoes for a long time and
Yeah.
and is making this decision deliberately. And speaking of kind of walking in shoes, I'd love to get your perspective on the DNC because you and I had a chance to spend
Yeah.
some time together, and I kind of sat there next to you, watching you react. And you're a guy who grew up listening, maybe not grew up, but in the past listened to like the Ben Shapiro's and Charlie Crooks of the world, and now you're kind of leading the charge to troll them and to shut them down when they spew BS on social media, which is basically everything that they post out there. What was it like being in that seat at the DNC? And you made a post to the effect of like, "Hey, I'm here. I didn't burst in flames. I didn't have horns come out
Yes.
of my
Yeah.
head. I'm
God
okay."
hasn't struck me dead yet. Yeah.
Exactly. Talk about your experience going from kind of pretty far right to being kind of in the belly of the beast, so to speak, according to the people still on the right.
Yeah, well, I grew up on talk radio. I grew up on Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity. I mean, I was steeped in that world. And then
Mhm.
when I was, a young adult, listened to Ben Shapiro. So definitely very familiar. Shameless plug. I just did an hour-long recap of all my full thoughts on the DNC. So you can see it on my YouTube channel or
No,
on
why
our
would I edit that
podcast.
out? I want people to go and listen. And anyone listening to the show, follow Tim. Like, follow him and support
Thank you,
him.
friend. That means a
That's the way to
lot.
do it. Yeah.
So here's the thing. Just high level. First off, I'm a professional musician. On a production level, it was just mind blowing how big and how complicated the rig that they were running was. That blew my mind. A couple of things stuck out to me. First off, I was always taught that Democrats hate America, they hate the country. And then all of a sudden, I'm sitting there 50,000 people have American flags. They're singing "Born in the USA." They're chanting "USA." And I'm like, whoa, this is jarring because I was not told any of this. I didn't know that people were so patriotic in the Democratic Party. Frankly, even for me, I was a little uncomfortable because as a Jesus follower, I have a real critique of empire, right? And I
Sure.
think about like who is our allegiance to in the military, all that. I wrestle with those tensions. So that was interesting. It was also interesting to see how big of a tent a lot of the DNC actually was. Like I've been to Turning Point USA events. I've been to America Fest. It
Mm,
was, and I feel like in the RNC they'll have people of color on stage, and it just comes across as like tokenization.
mm.
But at the DNC, it was just who they were. Like they weren't trying. They were just, we're gonna have this person speak because they're a representative or they're a senator or they're a governor, and they just happened to be not white, right? It was just kind of a fruit of who they were. Obviously, one of my big tensions, I know you and I talked about this, we wrestled with this, was that there were no Palestinian voices on the
Yeah.
stage. And that, it's to some, I felt a lot of hope in so many ways, but there was like a gray cloud kind of hanging over the whole thing, knowing that some of our most marginalized neighbors who are part of the Democratic Party, by the way, they're delegates, they're embedded in the system.
Yep.
All they wanted was just access to the same platform that so many needed voices, including Jewish voices, got access to, right? Like I'm in full support of all that. That part was tough for me to swallow. I don't know if that was some DNC strategy. I don't know what caused them to do that, but it felt like, man, we're so close. Why weren't these voices allowed to have their moment so we can all say solidarity with those people as well? That part was tough for me. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
I'm still wrestling through that, and I don't want to become a sycophant of a particular political party because I come from a world that was sycophantic of the MAGA world, right? So
Right.
I'm always trying to hold this both and tension of I find a lot of hope in the DNC in so many ways. I love the overall direction, but also we have to be that squeaky wheel, I believe, especially as Jesus followers, to always be advocating for the marginalized. I mean, Jesus says, liberate the oppressed, take care of the sick, feed the hungry, right? We have an obligation to always be thinking about who has fallen through the cracks of any system, even ones that we
Right.
overwhelmingly support, and how do we get their voices elevated as well?
I co-sign that 100%. And for those listening, I want to point out, because Tim's too modest to, that he stood side by side with the uncommitted protesters and documented that and bore witness to that. And I think that's important because that's kind of the litmus test to me right now. That do you believe in the humanity of Palestinians the
Yeah.
way you should believe in the humanity of Jewish people, the way you should believe in the
Yes.
humanity of women, of LGBTQ people, of these marginalized communities. You can't be selective in that. And it was powerful for me to watch Tim kind of unapologetically be present in the moment and recognize, and for him to bring this up on his own today is also, I think, indicative of how this journey he's on is far from complete. But I think that's kind of the point, right? It should never be complete. It's a constant journey to self-improvement, self-growth. From the Islamic concept, that's what the true jihad actually
Mm.
is. That the
Mm.
jihad means a struggle against injustice. And what
Mm.
you're engaging in is a true jihad against injustice. It's the greatest jihad. It's the jihad of self-improvement. And you're right, that part is still leaving a very salty taste in my mouth,
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
to put it lightly.
Yeah.
And I want to double down on this point you made, Tim, that we cannot make the mistake of being blind followers of a party because the other guys are bad guys. That
Yep.
this binary is really dangerous. And I'm not trying to equivocate the two parties right now.
Right.
What
Obviously.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to say is that our obligation, if we truly want to uphold our founding documents principles of forming a more perfect union,
Yep.
is to constantly call towards more perfection. I don't know of any person, let's even take something as simple as a marriage between two people. I don't know of any married couple that will look at each other and say, my spouse is perfect in every way, shape, and form.
Right.
Like, my wife would certainly never say that. And I guess she has a lot to point to. But the point is that a healthy marriage, you love the person, and that's why you're comfortable saying, hey, here's something I wish we could do differently or better. And that's what strengthens the marriage. If that's
Yes.
true on a one-on-one relationship, that should absolutely be true on a one-on 330 million person relationship.
1,000%. And I want to be clear to your audience, all of these things for me come out of radical allegiance to Jesus. This is why I'm so frustrated with Christian
Right.
nationalism, with the hijacking of the Christian message. And by the way, it's Christian. What they're doing is a particular Christian stream, but I believe it is antichrist in nature. Okay.
Mm.
And so to me, it's just so difficult to read the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes and go, essentially, here's the difference, Qasim. Jesus tells us to bear a cross for our enemies. Christian nationalists want to build crosses for theirs. That's
Mm.
the best way to sum up the difference.
That,
And for me as a Jesus person, I need to bear a cross for even the people I don't like. People often ask me, Tim, what, you're just giving into like culture. What's so hard about being your type of Christian? How about loving my enemies? I don't want to love Charlie Kirk. I don't want to love Trump. Okay, but I'm commanded to by Jesus, and what that looks like could be different. Accountability is part of that, but I still have an obligation to recognize the humanity of those people, not to dehumanize them. So it's not always easy, but my
yeah.
allegiance to Jesus compels me.
And, Tim, I think, when you study global affairs, you find in other countries that have a faith minority, the consistent excuse used to marginalize that faith minority is dehumanization.
100%.
Whether it's Muslims in Pakistan marginalizing Christians, whether it's Hindus marginalizing Muslims in India, whether it's Buddhists marginalizing the Rohingya in Myanmar, whether it's state atheist China marginalizing the Uyghurs in China.
Yep.
It's a consistent platitude every single time. Well, they're not as equal as we are, and therefore they don't qualify for the same rights. And that's why this messianic teaching from Jesus Christ is so critical. Loving your enemies it can't just be lip service. Otherwise, what the hell is the point of just loving the people you already agree with?
The second we start dehumanizing our enemies is the second we're on the same path they're on that will ultimately end up in violence.
That's right.
Always.
That's right.
Always. And that's
Yep.
why we refuse. I mean, we're so careful. I don't call Trump the orange man. I'm really careful with
Don't
my
either.
critiques because
Yeah.
the second I even look at that path is the second I'm on the same path as them. And I want to be nothing like them. We have
Yeah.
to find a better way forward. It can't be that.
No, it's exactly right. I'm not that I'm perfect on this, but I even avoid liking comments that dehumanize Trump. As much
Same.
as I despise the man because of
Yep.
his actions and his vile acts,
Yep.
the dehumanization is a dangerous thing because it's very easy to go from dehumanizing Trump to dehumanizing his supporters to dehumanizing the children of his supporters, who could be a 15-year-old kid wearing a shirt that he doesn't fully understand, and suddenly you're cutting off any hope of there being progress in the future.
100%.
If you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Tim Whitaker, a musician and founder of the New Evangelicals, a left-wing Christian evangelical organization. Check them out across social media at the New Evangelicals. Check out his podcast as well. Brilliant thought leader in the space. Exciting to see his platform grow. Down to about the last 10 minutes. And I think I want to spend a little bit more time talking about what are the practical things that we should be doing to have these tough conversations with members of our family. One critique that I see coming from Black and brown people towards white Americans is, hey, the majority of white Americans keep voting for Trump. Hold your own accountable. The same way you ask Muslims to, why don't you stop Islamic terrorism? Or why don't you, why don't people
Right.
stop Black on Black violence? And, these nonsense. Like, does that same critique apply here as well? What can white people do to combat the rise of right-wing evangelicalism among right-wing Christians? I'll give you an example. More white women voted for Trump in 2016 than for Hillary. And what's wild about that is in 2020, the number of white women who voted for Trump increased over 2016.
Wow.
Which is just incredible. What's causing that? And what can folks listening to this do to reach out to white evangelicals, white conservatives, and say, hey, by changing your perspective, you're not giving up your faith, you're actually exemplifying your faith.
Well, here's the problem. And this is, I'm also a realist. Okay. Most white Americans usually are Christian statistically, and most of that kind of Christianity is usually white evangelicalism. So they're in some kind of, either they're directly in or they're kind of in the outer ring. Most white evangelical Christians are not discipled by Jesus or their pastor. They're discipled by Tucker Carlson, by Ali Stuckey, by Charlie Kirk. That's who sends them their information. That's how they get their worldview. And there's a whole multi-billion-dollar industry that reinforces all of this stuff with language like, what does a biblical worldview look like? That's code for conservative white evangelical talking points.
Yeah.
I get asked this question a lot because I have a lot of people who are renegotiating their faith. Their dad's a huge Trump guy, or their family is, and it creates a lot of tension. I'm very pragmatic. I will tell you that my mind was never changed by being called a bigot or by being called, a jerk, or by being called ignorant. It was through people who held space for me and shared their stories and were patient with me. That being said, every familia relationship is different. For me and my parents, we just don't talk about this stuff. I'm not going to convince my dad. My dad's an amazing granddad to my two kids. They love my kids really well. They respect our boundaries, vice versa. My approach is, if I can show that we're here and that we love them no matter what, maybe one day that will kind of crack open the door to a wider conversation.
Yeah.
That's my approach. Some people have a relationship, though, where they can really talk to their parents. Their parents are able to reason and listen to them. Have that conversation. But think about it pragmatically. How do you get what you want out of the conversation? If you want them to change their mind, screaming at them, yelling at them, getting heated with them is probably not going to do it. Even giving them data and facts probably is not going to change their mind. Ask the questions, plant little seeds that make them question late at night. Yeah, why didn't I have a good answer for that? Yeah, that is a good point. Sometimes not sometimes, a lot of times the work gets done when you're not there.
That's right.
You plant your little seeds, water them occasionally, and then you have to let them do the work that they need to do over time. That's on the individual level. On the macro level, by all means, share content of voices that you respect on your social media platforms. Amplify voices. There are so many wonderful people, yourself included, Qasim, and many others, who are doing great, helpful work unpacking some of the layers of what's actually going on. I think that folks can use their social media platforms to amplify that. The other thing I'll say is make sure that you're registered to vote and get involved in your local politics. Get
Yeah.
run for school board, get involved at the local level. Local politics are really important, and it's important for you to know what's going on in your state, in your town, in your county, in your whatever it is, you know. So if you want to be part of the change, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a long struggle. I'm new to it, and I'm realizing how there are people decades before me laying down the groundwork that now I'm building off of, right?
Yeah.
So just be ready to invest in the long term. This is not an overnight thing. One final thought, and I'll get back to you. We have to understand that Trump is not a fluke. Trump was the fruit of decades of networking and funding and white evangelical structures being built with a certain worldview that
Yeah.
produced in 2016 Trump. That took
Yeah.
decades. It started in the 80s with the moral majority.
Right.
So you don't win or you don't push for a better path forward in one election cycle. After
Right.
this election, no matter who wins, the work just begins.
Right.
We have to think on a systemic level, the bigger picture of how do we plan for 10, 20, 30 years out and build structures that can sustain a better path that frankly wants the rights of all of our neighbors to be protected, that wants wages for all of our neighbors to go up,
Right.
that wants to stop sending bombs to countries that are being used on children. These are not crazy things. These are not radical things. These are just human concepts, right? Let's stop bombing kids. Let's make sure people who work can actually afford to pay their bills. That's not a radical Marxist agenda, people. It is just loving our neighbor well.
It's very basic common sense. And you brought up a couple of really good points I want to double down on. One, I don't expect that we should wait 50 years to protect reproductive health. But to your point, the right wing took 50 years systemically to pack the Supreme Court and eventually flip that. And it didn't happen overnight. It took 50 years. I also want to give you some flowers on this, Tim, because you self-admittedly you're new to this space, but one of the things I admire about the way you talk about these things is you're not coming in saying, okay, now that I'm here, let me tell you how to do things. You really are doing a brilliant job of elevating other voices that have been doing the work, learning from them, and in some ways using their coattails, and where you do have the expertise, leading by example. But I appreciate the nuance with which you have these conversations, because we see a lot of folks kind of jump in, go full speed ahead, burn out, and then end up doing more harm than good. So I appreciate the way you're doing these things too.
White supremacy can be found in progressive spaces sometimes too, right?
Yes.
I mean, white people mean well. They walk in, they now own the space. Now they're going to tell you how to do it. My encouragement to anyone, especially if you're a white man, is to sit and listen and follow the lead of others who have come before you and find out how you can support the work that they're doing. Read the books, do the work, listen to people whose experience is nothing like yours. Let them shape how you see these issues. There's a reason why I do not critique Black women or BIPOC folks with how they critique the Harris administration or not. That is not my lane.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not my job. That's for them to manage, and I just listen and learn. So knowing your lane and where you support and where you just shut up and say, you know what, this is not my fight. I just have to witness this and just be a support. That's the key here. And I think that white people, as we kind of decolonize, right, part of that is realizing that whenever we walk into a new space, we're not the center of attention. We don't own the space. We don't know everything. And we have an obligation to humble ourselves and listen accordingly and then follow along, helping wherever we can.
There's a brilliant Black scholar, Dr. Swad Al-Kabir, an historian at the University of Chicago, who has got a quote that I love, where she says that you don't need to be a voice for the voiceless. You just need to learn to pass the mic.
Exactly.
And I think that's exactly what you're saying. One of the other things, and we're on to our last couple of minutes that I want to double down on, when you talked about you're not going to win people over by calling them bigots relentlessly, especially people in your inner circle.
Yeah.
There's a lot of similarities. From the Islamic perspective, we recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and Prophet Muhammad praised him numerous times. And one of the similarities we see between the two men is when they were being harsh and critical, most of the time it was all to their followers already, that here's how you need to do better. But when they led by example to serve their enemies, it was through actual physical acts of service. We see very few examples by comparison of them pulling out scripture and beating people over the head with it. That was left more for the people who are already following them and them giving them guidance that here's how you need to do better. But in the cases of the people opposing them, it was finding ways to serve humanity indiscriminately and letting their actions do the talking. And I think there is a ton of wisdom for us in this space as well, that if you truly want to, St. Francis of Assisi, right? Preach the gospel wherever you go, and when necessary, use words.
Yep.
And I think that's a principle that needs to apply here. Tim, we're down to our last minute. How can folks follow you? How can they support you? How can they get involved with your work? And if someone is what's the word, deconstructing evangelical, how can they get involved with your work and partner with you and learn from you?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, you can find all of our work on any social media platform that is the New Evangelicals. I'm most active on Instagram. We do a lot of YouTube content as well. My DMs are open, our emails are open. We're a nonprofit organization, so you can support our work, of course, by donating, or you can go to our website to learn more.
Outstanding. My friends, I can't emphasize enough how much you're going to enjoy following Tim's content. Tim, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. So great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
We'll do it again soon. That is Tim Whitaker, founder and creator of the New Evangelicals. Follow him across social media at the New Evangelicals. You are listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126. The most awesome show in the multiverse. That was Tim Whitaker. Brilliant dude. Really love talking to him, learning from him. And we'll be sure to have him back on the show in the future. Make sure you follow him across platforms at the New Evangelicals. And again, I think what he brings to the table is recognition that we should all be on a journey, and that journey is it's scary, but it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's how we improve. I want to close with a story about men and how much better we need to do. I was on a flight. I was heading, I don't know where I was even flying to anymore. This was a little while ago, but I want to share this story about an experience I had on how too many men think listening to women is unimportant. And it's a short story, but it's going to close us out. And my challenge to men is to spend less time talking and more time listening, especially when women are talking, especially when women are expressing their personal concerns to you. It's critical that we listen. So I'm in line to catch a flight, head of a man, behind a woman. The woman leaves the line for like 30 seconds. I mean, just she had to grab something. I think she had to throw something away. She returns and stands right behind me. And I'm like, no, you can come back to your spot, when the guy behind me speaks up and he yells. He's like, hey, you can't cut in line like that. It's rude. And I'm not yelling as loud as he did, but he was completely insane. And it made her jump. I jumped too. I look back and he's furious. He's angry that she cut, allegedly. And so she replies super calmly and measured. And I'm sure that's because she knew if she yelled back, it might escalate even more. She goes, I didn't cut in line. And he cuts her off again. He goes, no, you cut. I saw. And she insists, I literally left for just a second. I was waiting for 20 minutes, just like you. And he cuts her off again. We were all waiting, lady, not just you. You can't cut. So finally I speak up. I'm like, ma'am, why don't you and I just switch? She whispers, thank you, and moves in front of me. I turn to the guy. He's upset. And I say once, very calmly, she was here before. I can vouch. I stare at him. And magically, like eureka, his whole demeanor changes. And suddenly, totally calm, he goes, oh, why did she just say so? How am I supposed to know that? And I'm looking at this guy like, are you kidding me? This poor woman, visibly shaken, just terrible. I ignore him. I turn back because we're about to board, which is just insane because he's yelling because we're all heading to the same flight in a few seconds anyway. Here's the thing, guys. It's helpful to close your mouth and listen to women sometimes. A lot of times. All the time. It's basic human decency. He refused to listen to a word she said, but the second I open my mouth, he's all ears. And like, as a side note, imagine the privilege of being able to yell loudly at an airport and not have to worry about airport security tackling you. But anyway, I digress. Something I could never do. But back to the point, this is the kind of guy who will hit on a woman, realizes she's with a guy, and then apologize to the guy because he respects him more than he respects her. Or a single woman having to put on a ring and say, I'm married, because she knows that he will respect her alleged fake husband more than her saying, I'm not interested. This is why women choose the bear, by the way. This is why. And don't come at me in your emails with not all men. If that's your knee-jerk response, you missed the point and you're probably part of the problem. Here's a message, guys. Be aware. Check yourself. Check other guys who keep their mouths open and ears shut when speaking to women. And the thing is, this is not a remarkable story. I'm not asking for like a pat on the back for what a great story I told. This is a very common story. That's the problem. That's why I'm sharing it, because we don't acknowledge how common this actually is. Guys need to take personal responsibility on gender equality, which brings us back to the start of the show about the Afghan crisis. We need to take responsibility for gender equality. We need to respect women's space and boundaries. It's literally the least we can do, because the end result of allowing this type of injustice to perpetuate is the gender apartheid we're seeing in Afghanistan. A friend of mine said to me, she goes, men have no idea how many calculations women have to make before every public move because of men who are completely inconsiderate of women and their personal spaces and their basic respect and dignity. It's on us, guys. We need to do better. We need to be more accountable. We need to hold our friends more accountable when we see them being disrespectful and abusive of women, whether certainly when it's physically, but also when it's verbally. All right, you're listening, or you've just listened to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126. I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you're listening on Substack, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I deeply enjoyed this content, creating it for you guys, these conversations we bring on, and it's extraordinarily helpful when I have your support, whether you can subscribe for free or for $6 a month or $50 a year. It makes a huge difference, and it means the world to me. Thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to follow me on social media at Qasim Rashid across all platforms. We'll continue to advance the show that builds on compassion and justice and accountability for those in power. Got a great show for next week. Be sure to tune in, same time, same place. Until next week, my friends, peace.